Let's start really simple. Let's just start by learning how to tell our story. In John chapter 9, there's a great story about a man who was born blind, and I think his story sets up for us a beautiful, simple framework of how to tell our story. When questioned about this man Jesus, who he alleges had healed him, had helped him to see, the religious leaders tell him, you need to give glory to God. This man Jesus is a sinner, and he responds in John 9 verse 25 by simply saying, I don't know if he's a sinner or not. All I know is I was blind and now I see. In that 13-word story, there's a very simple framework that I believe every one of us can learn from in how to tell our own story. And so what we're going to do is I want to walk you through that framework and help you to be able to write and to practice and to develop your own story of what God is doing in your life. So let's take a look at the 3-chair framework for how to tell your story. And this is very, very simple. Imagine 3 chairs. Chair number 1. Over here we have, there was a time when. There was a time when my life was filled with brokenness, filled with shame, filled with hurt, filled with anger, filled with despair, with addiction. This is the time in my life when, in the John 9 idea, we would be saying, this is when I was blind. This is when I couldn't see, when nothing was right, everything was off. There was a time in my life when. And then chair number 2. Then I met Jesus. One day he was going down the road, and here I met him. One day I bumped into a couple of guys who were Jesus followers, and they told me all these amazing stories, and then I really made this connection. One day I walked into the church for the first time in 20 years. One day there was this moment when I met Jesus. And then the 3rd chair is simply the end result of all of that. This is my life now. There was a time in my life when everything was off, and then I met Jesus, and this is what he's doing in me now. There's no more shame. There's no more guilt. There's freedom. I'm walking more lightly than I've ever walked in my entire life. The weight is gone. I have purpose. I have meaning. I have joy. God is leading me into his mission for my life. Everything is completely different now because I met Jesus. This is the John chapter 9 framework of how to tell your story. There was this time when I was blind and I met Jesus and now I see. And so this is the framework, the 3-chair framework for how to tell your story. So here's the thing. Now that you've got the 3-chair framework for your story, I want you to write it out. There was a time in my life when, and this is the heavy stuff. This is when I was blind. This is when I was burdened by shame and guilt and loneliness and whatever those things are. And this was when life wasn't great. And then I met Jesus, and here's how everything began to change. And now, this is what God is doing in my life now. So write it all out. There was a time in my life when, then I met Jesus, and now look what God is doing with me. Once you've written it all out, then the last question you ask after you tell your story is simply, do you have a story like that? And then practice putting it into 2 minutes, because here's the reality. You might bump into somebody at a store, at a coffee shop somewhere, and you've got a couple of minutes with that person, and maybe things are clicking and you're sharing your story and it's moving. You don't have 15 or 30 minutes necessarily, but you might have 2. You might have a couple. And so practice telling your story in a 2-minute window. To all the way through. Time in my life when, then I met Jesus, and this is what he's doing with me now. Do you have a story like that? And that question allows you to set up a potential next conversation. And so write your story out, begin to practice it, start timing yourself, put it into about a 2-minute window, and then practice by sharing with a trusted friend, a spouse, a child, someone that you trust with the story, so you get some reps in telling it and getting better and better at it each and every time. If you're really interested in what we're doing here at ForgeIn, I'd love for you to like the video, comment on the video, subscribe to the channel, because as we put out more stuff, I'd love for you to be able to be one of the first to hear about it, to get your hands on the training and the resources and the interviews and the other things that come along with it. So subscribe to the channel, make it kind of your home for disciple making resources as we help you make disciples to the 4th generation. I will see you next time.